A Dream Under Fire. Jamal Stevenson's sneakers squeaked on the worn hardwood floor as he launched into the air, arms extended, and watched the basketball sail smoothly through the hoop. The echo of the ball bouncing echoed through the empty high school gymnasium. At 17, basketball was more than just a sport for Jamal. It was his passion, his future, and his escape from the stifling small town of Lakeside, Georgia. His dream of playing college basketball was just within reach if he could make it through his final year without any issues. Lakeside was one of those places where everyone knew everyone. On the surface, it seemed like an idyllic southern town with its white picket fences, Friday night football games, and church socials. But underneath that picture-perfect exterior lay a simmering tension, one that people didn't talk about openly. Jamal had always known that despite his talent and popularity at school, he would have to work twice as hard to prove himself as a young black man in a town where the past still had a tight grip on the present. Jamal wiped the sweat from his forehead, glanced at the clock on the wall, and realized it was almost 10:30 p.m. He hurried to gather his things, slinging his basketball bag over his shoulder. He'd stayed late practicing, pushing himself harder than usual with the next game only a few days away. College scouts would be watching, and everything hinged on his performance. He could almost taste the scholarship offers. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, letting the crisp breeze wash over him. The gym lights blinked off behind him as the janitor locked up for the night. The streets of Lakeside were eerily quiet, with most of the town already fast asleep. Jamal began his walk home, his basketball held tightly under his arm. Lakeside wasn't far from the school, but the streets felt longer at night. As he turned onto Oak Street, a wave of unease washed over him. He couldn't pinpoint why, but something about the silence felt too heavy. His parents had always drilled it into his head. Be careful, Jamal. Be polite, keep your head down, and stay out of trouble. It was an unspoken truth in their household. Despite their hopes for the future, they understood the reality of being black in the South. Suddenly, the blinding glare of headlights snapped Jamal out of his thoughts. A police car rolled up behind him, red and blue lights flashing, casting long shadows against the houses. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the stories he'd heard from his parents and friends came rushing to his mind. He felt the fear they had spoken of so many times. "Hey, you there?" A voice boomed from the patrol car, the window sliding down. "Hold it right there." Jamal stopped dead in his tracks, the fear creeping up his spine. Two officers got out of the car, their boots crunching on the gravel as they approached him. They were both white, their faces set in stern, cold expressions. "What are you doing out so late, son?" The taller of the two officers asked, resting his hand on the holster of his gun. Jamal swallowed hard and forced his voice to remain steady. "I just finished basketball practice. Sir, I'm heading home." "Basketball practice, huh?" The shorter officer circled around him, eyeing him suspiciously. "Funny, because we've had reports of someone breaking into cars around here." "You sure you weren't doing that?" Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. "No, sir. I've been at the school gym all night. You can ask Coach Bailey. He'll tell you." The taller officer sneered. "Your coach isn't here, is he?" Jamal's stomach twisted into knots as he realized how quickly things were spiraling out of control. He had heard stories of encounters like this from his uncles and cousins, but now it was happening to him. His father, Marcus Stevenson, a well-respected community leader, had always told him to remain calm and polite in these situations. Jamal repeated his father's advice in his mind like a mantra. Stay calm. Don't resist. Don't escalate. ID, the taller officer demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Jamal reached slowly into his pocket, retrieving his wallet and handing over his school ID. He watched as the officer examined it, his expression remaining unreadable. "You been drinking?" The shorter officer asked abruptly, leaning in closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "No, sir. I don't drink," Jamal replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The taller officer tossed the ID back at Jamal. "We're going to need to search you. Hands on the car." Jamal blinked in shock. "But sir, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home." "Hands on the car now." The shorter officer snapped, reaching for his cuffs. Panic set in as Jamal slowly placed his hands on the hood of the patrol car. He could feel his pulse racing in his ears, his mind screaming for a way out, but he knew better than to run or argue. The officers roughly patted him down, their hands moving over his body with little regard for his comfort or dignity. Jamal's cheeks burned with humiliation as he noticed a few people from nearby houses watching the scene unfold from their windows. He had known many of them his whole life. "What's this?" The shorter officer muttered as he pulled Jamal's basketball out of his hands, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "Car thief with a basketball. Real clever." Jamal bit his tongue to keep from lashing out. He knew his words would fall on deaf ears. He was just another suspect in their eyes, another young black man who didn't belong. "Please, call my father," Jamal pleaded. "He'll explain everything." The taller officer laughed under his breath. "Your father, huh? And who's that?" "Some big shot." Jamal nodded, his voice trembling. "Yes, sir. Please. He's Marcus Stevenson. You can look him up. He's—" "Enough," the officer barked, grabbing Jamal's arms and snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer began, the words ringing hollow in Jamal's ears. Everything blurred as the situation spiraled out of control. His dream, his future, it all seemed to be slipping away in an instant. He felt helpless. "Please, just let me call him," Jamal begged again, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. "Please, my dad can explain." The officers exchanged a glance, and after a long pause, the taller one shrugged. "Fine. One call." With shaking hands, Jamal fumbled for his phone. He dialed his father's number, the only number he could think of in this moment. The phone rang twice before his father's deep, reassuring voice answered. "Jamal, what's going on? It's late." "Dad, I'm in trouble," Jamal whispered, his voice barely holding together. "The police, they think I did something. I didn't, I swear. They're arresting me." On the other end of the line, Marcus Stevenson fell silent for a long, heavy moment. Then, in a tone Jamal had never heard from his father before, a quiet, controlled fury emerged. "Where are you?" "On Oak Street, near the high school." "Stay calm, son," his father instructed. "I'll be there soon. Don't argue with them. Just stay calm. I'm on my way." Jamal's heart clenched as the officer snatched the phone from his hand, ending the call. He felt a small glimmer of hope amid his terror. His father was coming, and if anyone could make this right, it was Marcus Stevenson. As the officers shoved him into the back of the patrol car, Jamal stared out at the darkened streets, his mind racing. He had always feared this moment but hoped it would never come. He was a star athlete, an honors student, and a respected young man in his community. But tonight, none of that mattered. To these officers, he was just another suspect, just another black boy out after dark. Little did they know, Marcus Stevenson wasn't just any father. And their decision to arrest his son would soon set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of their small town, exposing long-buried tensions and challenging the fragile peace that had kept their community together for so long. The shattered trust. Jonathan Thompson pulled into his driveway, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind like a broken record. The town, which had prided itself on unity and civility, had been shaken to its core by the arrest of his son Jamal. The swirling confusion of emotions, rage, sorrow, disbelief, had barely left Jonathan any room to think clearly. But today, he knew he had to focus. As Jamal sat beside him in the passenger seat, his silence spoke volumes. The boy who once had an easy, open smile now stared blankly ahead, his fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. The sound of the engine idling in the quiet street felt oppressive, like the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. "Let's go inside, son," Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm. Jamal nodded without a word. As they walked into the house, the smell of freshly brewed coffee hit them, along with the low murmur of voices from the kitchen. Evelyn Thompson, Jamal's mother, sat at the table, speaking with a community leader named Grace Walker, a longtime friend and activist who had been a pillar of support to the family during difficult times. Grace, a woman in her late 50s with short-cropped salt and pepper hair and sharp, discerning eyes, looked up when they entered. Her eyes flickered with empathy when they landed on Jamal, but they quickly turned back to Jonathan. This wasn't just about family. It was about justice, about their community. And Grace wasn't one to waste time. "Jonathan," she said, standing and extending her hand. "Glad you're home. We need to talk." Jonathan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, weary from the storm of emotions and the sleepless night. "I know, Grace. Let me just check on Jamal first." Jamal shook his head, looking up at his father. "No, Dad, it's fine. I want to hear it. I want to be part of this." Evelyn crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Jamal, kissing the top of his head. "You don't need to be in the middle of this, baby. You've been through enough." Jamal pulled back, standing tall. Though only 17, there was a new strength in his posture, a resolve that hadn't been there before. "This is about me, Mom. I want to help." Grace nodded approvingly, motioning for everyone to sit. "All right, Jamal. If you're sure. We're going to need your voice in this anyway." They all sat around the table, the gravity of the situation heavy in the room. Jonathan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes scanning the faces of his family and Grace. "So, what do we do now?" Grace took a deep breath. "The community is angry, Jonathan. You know this is bigger than Jamal's arrest. This is about systemic issues, the kind of prejudice that's been simmering under the surface for years. People are tired. They're ready for change." Jonathan nodded. He had seen it, not just as a father, but as a black man who had lived his entire life navigating these waters. His own position as chief of police had given him a vantage point, a sense of hope that maybe he could make a difference from within. But now, as he looked into his son's eyes and thought about the humiliation he'd endured, that hope felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. "And what about the department?" Evelyn asked quietly, her voice trained. "What are you going to do about Miller and Reed?" Jonathan let out a long breath. "They're suspended, pending investigation. But I've already decided. They're gone. There's no place for that kind of behavior in my department." Grace nodded, but her face remained stern. "That's a good start, Jonathan, but this can't end with them. The whole system needs a reckoning. You know that as well as I do." Jamal spoke up then, his voice quiet but firm. "Dad, they didn't just arrest me. They made me feel small, like I didn't belong, like I was dangerous just for being outside at night." His words struck like a blow to Jonathan's heart. This was his son, a boy who had done everything right, worked hard in school, been respectful, stayed out of trouble. Yet none of that had mattered in the eyes of those officers. To them, he had been just another young black man, guilty by association with his skin color. Jonathan swallowed hard. "I know, son, and I'm so sorry. I should have been there to protect you." Jamal shook his head. "This isn't your fault, Dad. It's not just about us. It's about what's wrong in this town, in this country. I don't want to see this happen to anyone else." Grace leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Jamal's. "That's exactly why we need your help, Jamal. People need to hear your story. They need to understand that this isn't just about a bad call by two officers. It's about a pattern, about the way black boys and girls are seen in this society." Jonathan's stomach tightened at the thought of putting his son in the spotlight. "Are you sure about this, Jamal? Going public means the world will know. You'll be exposed to criticism, backlash." Jamal squared his shoulders, his eyes hard with determination. If telling my story helps make things better, then I want to do it. I don't care what people think. Grace smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. You're brave, Jamal. But Jonathan's right. This won't be easy. The town is already divided. There are going to be people who will want to twist your words, people who won't believe you, no matter how clear the truth is. Evelyn, who had been silent for much of the conversation, reached across the table and took Jamal's hand. If you want to do this, we'll support you. But you need to be ready for what comes next. Jamal nodded, his face set. I am. Jonathan looked at his son, a mixture of pride and fear swelling in his chest. He knew this wasn't just a battle against two bad officers. It was a fight against the ingrained prejudices of an entire town, maybe even the nation. And as much as he wanted to shield Jamal from that fight, he knew he couldn't. This was bigger than all of them. Grace stood, smoothing out her jacket. I'll start organizing. We need a public meeting, a forum where the community can hear from you, Jamal, and from others who've been affected by this. We'll gather testimonies, real stories from people who've faced the same kind of discrimination. We need the town to see the bigger picture. Jonathan nodded. I'll make sure the department cooperates fully with the investigation, and I'll speak to the mayor about the changes we need to implement. As Grace gathered her things and prepared to leave, Jamal spoke again, his voice softer now. Do you think this will actually change things? I mean, really change? Grace paused at the door, her hand resting on the knob. It's not going to be easy. Change never is. But it's worth fighting for, Jamal. And it starts with people like you. People who are brave enough to stand up and tell the truth, no matter the cost. With that, she left, and the house fell into a heavy silence. Jamal looked at his parents, his mind racing with everything that had just been discussed. The weight of it all, the injustice, the anger, the fear, settled over him like a cloak. But beneath that weight was a flicker of something else. Hope. That night, as Jamal lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he thought about what lay ahead. The meeting, the scrutiny, the inevitable backlash. But he also thought about the kids who would hear his story and maybe, just maybe, feel a little less alone, a little less afraid. In that moment, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all of them. For every kid who had ever felt scared, humiliated, or powerless. And no matter how hard it got, he wasn't going to back down. As he drifted off to sleep, Jamal made a silent promise to himself. He would be the voice they needed. The voice that refused to be silenced. Voices of change. The church hall was packed to the brim, its usual quiet serenity replaced by a cacophony of hushed voices, shuffling feet, and the tension that clung to the air like static before a storm. The chairs, usually neatly arranged for Sunday service, had been pulled into an impromptu semicircle facing a small stage. The energy in the room was charged. A mixture of anger, hope, and apprehension buzzed through the crowd. Jonathan Thompson stood near the entrance, scanning the room as more people streamed in. He felt the familiar weight of his badge pressing against his chest, a reminder of his dual role tonight, not just as a father, but as the chief of police in a town that was on the brink. He caught a glimpse of his son Jamal sitting near the front, looking calm, though Jonathan knew his son well enough to see the anxiety in the way his hands fidgeted in his lap. The community had come together tonight, but it wasn't for a sermon. It was a forum, organized by Grace Walker and the local activists, meant to be a platform for voices that had been long silenced. And Jamal, his son, would be at the center of it. Chief Thompson, the voice interrupted his thoughts. Jonathan turned to see Mayor Carla Matthews approaching, her expression tight. The mayor, a pragmatic woman with a no-nonsense attitude, had been supportive in the aftermath of Jamal's arrest, but tonight even she looked unsettled. Carla, Jonathan greeted her, his voice low. Thanks for coming. She nodded, glancing around at the packed room. I had to. This isn't something we can afford to ignore. Jonathan sighed. "No, we can't." The crowd grew quiet as Grace Walker, dressed in her signature bold-colored scarf, stepped onto the small stage, microphone in hand. She waited for the last murmurs to fade before speaking, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Grace began, her gaze sweeping across the room, making sure to connect with as many faces as possible. "We are here because something happened that can't be swept under the rug. This is about more than just one incident. It's about the systemic issues that have been hurting our community for years. It's time we talk about it. Openly, honestly. And that starts now." She motioned to a small group of people who had been seated in the front row, including Jamal. "Tonight, we will hear from members of this community, people who have experienced injustice, discrimination, and mistreatment, often at the hands of those sworn to protect them. These are not just individual stories. They are a reflection of a deeper problem." Jonathan felt his heart tighten as Grace turned toward Jamal, motioning him to the stage. His son stood up slowly, the eyes of the room turning to him. Some sympathetic, some wary, others unreadable. The tension in the room thickened as Jamal approached the microphone. Jonathan clenched his fists, willing himself to stay composed. He was used to controlling situations, de-escalating conflict. But this wasn't something he could control. This was Jamal's moment, and all Jonathan could do was watch. Jamal's voice, when he spoke, was calm but clear. "My name is Jamal Thompson," he began, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "Most of you know me, or know my dad. I'm just a kid from this town, like a lot of the people here. I've always tried to do the right thing. But none of that mattered last week." A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the crowd. Jonathan could see some of his own officers scattered throughout, their faces stiff with tension. This was as much about them as it was about the community. Jamal continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. "Last week, I was out with some friends, just walking home. I wasn't doing anything wrong, just minding my own business. But when Officers Miller and Reed saw me, that didn't matter. To them, I was just another black kid out after dark. A problem. They didn't ask me what I was doing or if I needed help. They threw me against a car, put me in cuffs, and treated me like a criminal before even asking any questions." The room was silent now, the weight of Jamal's words hanging in the air. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he saw the pain in his son's eyes, the vulnerability that no amount of bravery could hide. "I was scared," Jamal admitted, his voice faltering for a moment. "Not just because of what was happening, but because I realized that it didn't matter who I was or what I'd done. To them, I was guilty the moment they saw me." A murmur of agreement ran through parts of the audience. Jonathan saw heads nodding, others looking down at their feet in shame. The truth of Jamal's words was undeniable, especially to those who had lived through similar experiences. Jamal's voice steadied again. "I know I'm not the only one this has happened to. There are so many people in this town who've gone through the same thing, who've been stopped, questioned, or treated unfairly just because of how we look. That's why I'm here tonight. To tell my story, but also to stand up for everyone else who's been too afraid to speak up." Jonathan's throat tightened as he watched his son on that stage. This was more than just courage. It was defiance. It was a declaration that Jamal refused to be silenced, refused to let fear dictate his life. Grace took the microphone again, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "Thank you, Jamal. Your bravery tonight speaks volumes, not just to this community, but to everyone who's listening. And now we're going to hear from others. Because this isn't just Jamal's story, it's all of ours." The next speaker was a middle-aged woman, a local teacher named Linda Davis. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the microphone, her voice soft at first. My son was stopped last year," she began, her voice cracking. "He was walking home from his part-time job, and they pulled him over for no reason. He's a good boy, works hard, stays out of trouble, but that didn't matter. They treated him like he was nothing. As Linda shared her story, the air in the room shifted. More people began nodding, some wiping away tears. It became clear that Jamal's experience was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, one that had been quietly accepted for too long. One by one, people came forward. A teenage girl who had been followed by police while walking home from school. A young man who had been stopped and frisked on his way to church. A father who had been pulled over and harassed in front of his children. Each story built on the last, creating an overwhelming sense of shared pain, but also of solidarity. By the time the last speaker sat down, the room was heavy with emotion. Grace stepped up once more, her face serious. "We've heard the stories. We've seen the pain. Now the question is, what are we going to do about it?" Jonathan stood, finally stepping forward. He had known this moment would come, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The eyes of the room turned to him as he took the stage, his police uniform standing in stark contrast to the raw humanity that had just been shared. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I've spent my entire career trying to be the kind of police officer that people can trust," he began, his voice low but firm. "I've tried to lead my department with integrity, to be a bridge between the law and the community. But tonight, I realize that I haven't done enough." His words were met with silence. Jonathan could see the skepticism in some of the faces before him. They weren't wrong to doubt him. He had to prove that his words were more than just a performance. "I can't change the past," Jonathan continued, "but I can change how we move forward. Starting tomorrow, I'm implementing a full review of our department's policies on racial profiling and use of force. And those who have acted in ways that violate the trust of this community will be held accountable." A murmur ran through the crowd, a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. Jonathan pressed on, his voice gaining strength. "But this isn't just about police reform. This is about how we see each other, how we treat each other. I'm asking everyone in this room to work with me, not as enemies, but as partners. We need to rebuild this town from the ground up. And that starts with listening, with understanding, and with real, meaningful change." Grace stepped up beside him, her expression resolute. "We will hold you to that, Chief Thompson. The community is ready for change, and we're not going to stop until we get it." Jonathan nodded, his gaze meeting Jamal's across the room. He saw pride in his son's eyes, but also a quiet challenge. This was just the beginning. As the meeting drew to a close, the room buzzed with the energy of a movement just beginning to take shape. People talked in hushed groups, plans forming, ideas being shared. The fight wasn't over. It had barely begun. But tonight, they had taken the first step. Together. And Jonathan knew, for the first time in a long time, that change was possible. The tipping point. The next few days in Hammond felt different, as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the weight of the promises made that night to either crumble or ignite real transformation. Tension hung in the air, but so did a cautious sense of hope. The events of the community forum were now the talk of every corner of the town. At the barbershops, in the churches, at the high school, and across social media. Jamal was still trying to process the aftermath of his speech. His phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, some from classmates he never expected to reach out. But with the praise came whispers, side glances, and a kind of attention that made him feel exposed. He had put himself out there in front of the entire town, and now, for better or worse, he was part of something much bigger than himself. "Jamal, man, you're practically a celebrity," his friend Devin said, nudging him in the hallway after school. "You gonna run for mayor or something next?" Jamal gave a half smile, shaking his head. "Nah, I'm good on that. I'm just trying to survive junior year." But even as he joked with Devin, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world around him had shifted. It wasn't just him, though. His dad was walking that same tightrope between duty and conscience. At home, Jonathan seemed distracted, spending long nights in his study and having quiet phone conversations that stopped the moment Jamal or his mom walked into the room. The conversations between father and son had grown sparse, but there was an unspoken understanding. Both of them were navigating new terrain, Jonathan within the police force, and Jamal within a rapidly changing social climate. What neither of them could have predicted was how quickly the situation would escalate. 2 weeks after the forum, Hammond became the center of attention in a way that no one had wanted. It was a Friday night when it happened. A police stop gone wrong, captured on a shaky phone camera, and uploaded to social media before anyone even knew what was happening. A young black man, Marcus Reed, had been pulled over by officers Miller and Reed, the same officers who had detained Jamal. What started as a routine stop quickly spiraled into chaos. The footage was blurry, the audio muffled by the shouting, but the image of Marcus being slammed to the ground, handcuffed while screaming for help, was crystal clear. Within hours, the video had gone viral, not just in Hammond but far beyond. Hashtags calling for justice spread like wildfire, and soon national news outlets were picking up the story. The narrative was familiar. Another black man brutalized by the police. But this time, it was happening in a small town that had only recently begun to grapple with its own demons. The pressure was about to reach a boiling point. Jonathan sat at his desk, staring at the footage on his computer screen, his heart sinking with every second that played. He knew this was bad, worse than anything he'd anticipated. The officers involved were under his command. This had happened on his watch. His phone rang, breaking through his thoughts. It was Mayor Carla Matthews. "Jonathan," she said, her voice tense. "We have a problem." "I know, Carla. I've seen the footage. We're going to have protests, not just from the locals. The news crews are already descending. This is about to explode." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the town's future resting squarely on his shoulders. "I'll handle it. I'm suspending Miller and Reed, pending an investigation. But that's not going to be enough, is it?" "No, it won't be," Carla replied sharply. "People are angry, Jonathan. This isn't just about policy anymore. This is about trust, or the lack of it." As he hung up the phone, Jonathan felt a surge of helplessness he hadn't experienced in years. How could he fix something that had been broken long before he ever wore a badge? And now, it was his responsibility to keep the town from tearing itself apart. That evening, Jamal was at home scrolling through his phone. The images of Marcus' arrest burned into his mind. His stomach twisted in knots as he read the comments, both from people in his town and strangers online. Some of the comments were supportive, calling for justice, but others were vicious, blaming Marcus for resisting, for escalating, for simply being black in the wrong place at the wrong time. A knock on his bedroom door pulled him out of his thoughts. His mom, Tina, poked her head in, her face tight with concern. "Jamal, your dad wants to talk to us downstairs." Jamal sighed, already knowing what this was about. He followed his mom to the living room, where Jonathan stood by the fireplace, looking more worn out than Jamal had ever seen him. "Son," Jonathan started, his voice strained, "I'm sure you've seen what's going on." Jamal nodded, his jaw clenched. "I saw the video." Jonathan rubbed the back of his neck, as if trying to find the right words. "This is going to be bad. Real bad. People are going to be protesting, and I don't know how it's going to play out. I just need you to be careful, okay? Stay out of trouble. Don't get involved." Jamal's eyes narrowed. "Don't get involved." "Dad, I'm already involved. You saw what happened to Marcus. How am I supposed to just sit here and do nothing?" "I know you're upset, but," Jonathan started, but Jamal cut him off. "No, you don't know." Jamal's voice rose, the frustration bubbling up. "You don't get it. This keeps happening, and nothing ever changes. I can't just stay quiet." "I won't." Tina stepped in, her voice soft but firm. "Jonathan, he's right. This is about more than just being safe. It's about standing up for what's right." Jonathan looked between his wife and son, the weight of their words pressing down on him. He wanted to protect Jamal, to shield him from the dangers he knew all too well. But he also knew that Jamal was no longer a child. He was part of this fight now, whether Jonathan liked it or not. Jonathan began, his voice breaking slightly. I don't want you to get hurt. Jamal's expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. I know, Dad, but this isn't something I can run from. The room fell into a tense silence, the reality of the situation settling over them all. Finally, Jonathan nodded, his shoulders sagging with resignation. Okay, he said quietly. Just be careful. By the next morning, the protest had been organized, and the streets of Hammond filled with people, locals, activists from nearby towns, and even a few familiar faces from the community forum. They marched with signs that read, Justice for Marcus, End Police Brutality, and No More Silence. Jamal stood among the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. Devin was by his side, as well as Grace Walker, who had become one of the key organizers. The air buzzed with a mixture of anger and hope, the voices of the people rising together in chants that echoed down the streets. At the front of the protest, Jamal saw a familiar figure, his father, Jonathan, standing alongside a few officers who had been assigned to monitor the march. Their eyes met briefly, and Jonathan gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement of the line they were both walking. As the march moved toward the police station, tension began to thicken. A line of officers stood at the entrance, watching the crowd with steely gazes. Jamal could feel the unease rippling through the protesters as they approached the line of uniforms. Grace stepped forward with a megaphone, her voice clear and commanding. We are here today to demand justice for Marcus Reed. We are here because the system has failed us again and again, and we will no longer be silent. The crowd erupted in cheers, the energy building as more voices joined in. But as the chants grew louder, Jamal noticed something. A few people in the crowd, faces covered with bandanas, holding rocks and bottles in their hands. His heart sank. He knew what was about to happen. Grace, Jamal shouted, trying to get her attention. But it was too late. A bottle sailed through the air, smashing against the ground near the line of officers. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The crowd, the officers, the world itself held its breath. Then chaos erupted. The line of police surged forward, riot shields up as they pushed the crowd back. Protesters shouted in confusion, some running for cover while others stood their ground. Jamal found himself caught in the crush of bodies, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He saw his father in the midst of it, trying to hold the line but also protect the people in front of him. Jonathan's eyes locked on Jamal's, a mixture of fear and determination in them. Get back, Jonathan shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. Jamal, get out of here. But Jamal couldn't move. He was frozen, caught between the push of the crowd and the pull of his own convictions. This was the tipping point, the moment when everything could either fall apart or be made whole. And in that moment, Jamal knew that there was no turning back. Shattered silence. Jamal's world spun in chaotic blurs. The rush of panicked bodies around him, the sharp commands of police officers, and the rising tide of fury from the crowd. Time stretched out in strange, jagged fragments. It felt as though he was watching from outside his own body, caught in a moment that was spiraling out of control. People were screaming. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the air as more bottles were thrown, their sharp shatter a grim prelude to the violence that followed. He saw Grace ahead of him, clutching her megaphone, trying to rally the protesters to hold their ground, but her voice was swallowed by the cacophony of the riot breaking out around her. Jamal's mind raced, heart pounding in his chest. He had come here to stand for something, to demand change, not to witness his town descend into chaos. But everything was unraveling. He was jolted back to reality as someone shoved into him from behind, knocking him forward. His hand shot out to steady himself, but the movement thrust him closer to the line of officers. The shield wall was pressing forward, slowly but surely, pushing the protesters back down the street. Through the haze of noise, Jamal caught sight of his father, Jonathan, at the front of the police line. Jonathan's face was grim, his jaw tight as he coordinated the officers, urging them to remain steady, to hold the line. His eyes scanned the crowd, calculated, controlled, until they landed on Jamal. In that instant, father and son locked eyes, and Jamal could see it. The flicker of fear, the silent plea that said more than words ever could. Jonathan's expression seemed to say, "Please, don't be here. Please, get out of this before it's too late." But Jamal couldn't leave. Not now. Not when everything he had spoken up for, everything his community had rallied around, was being tested in this very moment. He stood his ground, the weight of the choices before him settling heavily on his shoulders. As the pressure from the crowd surged, Jamal suddenly felt a hand grab his arm. He turned to see Grace, her face pale but determined. "We need to calm people down," she shouted over the noise. This wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to go like this. Jamal nodded, the words catching in his throat. He knew they had to do something, anything to stop the violence before it swallowed everything whole. Together, they pushed through the crowd, trying to reach the front lines where the tension was at its peak. They were too late. A group of masked figures, emboldened by the growing chaos, surged forward with rocks in their hands. They hurled them at the police line with full force, and the clash that followed was like nothing Jamal had ever seen. Riot shields clashed with bodies. Shouts turned into screams. The tide of people swelled and crashed against the unmoving wall of police in riot gear. Jamal's breath caught in his throat as he watched officers reach for tear gas canisters, the canisters flying through the air and hissing as they hit the ground, spewing white clouds of gas into the crowd. Panic swept through the protesters as they scattered, some falling to the ground, others stumbling blindly, coughing and choking. The acrid burn hit Jamal's lungs like a punch, and he doubled over, gasping for air. He could barely see through the sting of tears that blurred his vision. Around him, people were screaming, some running in all directions, others staying to clash with the officers. A strong arm suddenly wrapped around Jamal's shoulders, pulling him back through the crowd. He blinked furiously to clear his eyes, and through the haze, he saw Devon's familiar face. Devon's voice was frantic, shouting over the roar of the protest, but Jamal could barely hear him. "We need to get out of here, man. This is bad. It's real bad." Jamal shook his head, resisting the pull. "No, we can't leave. Grace. Grace is still. Forget Grace, Jamal. We'll find her later. You're gonna get yourself killed out here." Jamal struggled against Devon's grip, his mind a swirl of panic and adrenaline. He couldn't just leave, not when everything was falling apart. But Devon was stronger, and before Jamal could protest further, he was dragged back through the mob of fleeing protesters, away from the front lines. The hours that followed were a blur of chaos. By the time the protest had dissipated, Hammond streets were a battleground of debris, broken glass, and the remnants of tear gas lingering in the air. The news vans had descended upon the scene, eager to capture the story of the small town caught in the crossfire of a national reckoning. Jamal, exhausted and disoriented, found himself sitting on the curb of a side street, away from the heart of the protest. Devon was next to him, clutching a water bottle and shaking his head in disbelief. "I didn't think it would go like this," Devon muttered, his voice low. "I mean, I knew it could get bad. But this—" Jamal didn't respond. His thoughts were a storm of anger, frustration, and guilt. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. They had come to demand justice, to peacefully make their voices heard. But instead, the violence had overshadowed everything, hijacking their cause and turning it into something ugly. A few feet away, Jamal saw Grace sitting on the sidewalk, her head in her hands. She looked defeated, her megaphone lying discarded beside her. The fire that had burned so fiercely in her earlier was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. Jamal pushed himself to his feet and stumbled over to her. Grace looked up as he approached, her eyes red from the tear gas. "Jamal," she whispered, her voice hollow. "What have we done?" Jamal sat beside her, the weight of the question hanging heavy in the air. He didn't have an answer. Everything felt shattered, like the very fabric of what they had fought for had been torn apart by the violence they had tried so hard to avoid. "I don't know," Jamal finally said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know anymore." For a long time, they sat in silence, the sounds of sirens and distant voices echoing through the streets. Around them, Hammond felt like a different place, one where the hope for change had been drowned out by fear and anger. Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a message from his father. "Where are you? Are you safe?" He stared at the screen for a moment, the words blurring before his eyes. What could he even say? That he had witnessed everything he feared, that the protest they had hoped would spark real change had instead become another statistic in the endless cycle of violence. His phone buzzed again. "Jamal, answer me, please." With trembling fingers, Jamal typed a response. "I'm okay. I'm with Grace." But even as he sent the message, he knew the truth. He wasn't okay. None of them were. The fallout from the protest hit Hammond like a shockwave. By the next morning, the town was flooded with news coverage, interviews, and social media posts dissecting every moment of the chaos. Videos of the riot circulated online, and opinions poured in from every corner of the internet. Some condemned the police for their aggressive response. Others blamed the protesters for turning to violence. Jamal watched it all unfold, a growing sense of helplessness settling in his chest. The movement that had started with so much promise now felt tainted. The story wasn't about justice anymore. It was about the riot, the clash between protesters and police, the violence that had stolen the spotlight. At home, things were tense. Jonathan was more withdrawn than ever, disappearing into his office for long stretches of time, while Tina tried to keep the peace, but even she seemed weighed down by the tension. Jamal barely spoke to his father, their relationship strained by the events of the past few weeks. One evening, Jamal found himself sitting on the back porch, staring out at the quiet streets of Hammond. He heard the door open behind him and turned to see his father step outside. Jonathan looked tired, his face drawn and lined with the weight of everything that had happened. For a long time, neither of them said anything. They just stood there, the silence between them thick and heavy. Finally, Jonathan spoke, his voice quiet. "I've seen protests like that before, Jamal. I've seen how they can turn ugly." Jamal looked at him, the frustration still bubbling beneath the surface. "So what? We're just supposed to stay quiet, not fight back when things get bad." Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, I'm not saying that. But there has to be a better way, son. A way that doesn't end with tear gas and broken glass." Jamal's voice was sharp, filled with the bitterness he had tried to keep at bay. "There's no better way when the system's broken, Dad. You can't fix something that's been broken for this long by just playing by the rules." Jonathan met his gaze, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I know, Jamal. But I also know that violence doesn't solve it. It only makes things worse." Jamal turned away, staring out at the darkening sky. He didn't know how to respond to that. All he knew was that the weight of everything felt too heavy to carry alone. And as they stood there in the quiet of their backyard, Jamal wondered if the change they had fought for was still possible, or if, like so many times before, it would slip through their fingers, lost to the chaos. Echoes of the storm. The days after the protest felt like an unending haze for Jamal. The chaos of that night hung over him like a dark cloud, pressing down on every conversation, every thought, and every moment of silence. The once bustling energy of Hammond had faded, replaced by an eerie quiet. The streets were no longer filled with chants and signs. Instead, they were marked by the scars of what had transpired. Boarded-up windows, graffiti scrawled on walls, and the pervasive sense of tension that made even simple interactions feel heavy. Jamal found himself walking through the town, his feet carrying him past places that were once familiar, but now felt distant, almost foreign. The cafe where he used to grab coffee with Devon and Grace was closed, its windows covered with plywood. The park where they had gathered to plan their protests was deserted, the benches overturned as if no one dared to reclaim them. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of something broken, something fractured beyond repair. The messages on social media hadn't stopped. Opinions flooded his feed, some supportive, others condemning. People he didn't even know were tagging him, arguing about the protest, the violence, and the role he and Grace had played. His inbox was full of messages, some offering solidarity, others accusing him of being part of the problem. It was overwhelming, and no matter how many times he tried to disconnect, the world kept pulling him back into the fray. Grace had been quieter since that night. The fire that once fueled her speeches, her determination to fight for change, seemed dimmed. She wasn't defeated, Jamal knew that much, but there was a weight in her that hadn't been there before. They hadn't spoken much, only exchanging a few words about how things had gone wrong, but the connection they once shared felt strained, as if the protest had erected a wall between them. One afternoon, Jamal found himself standing outside her apartment, unsure of whether to knock or walk away. He hesitated for a long moment, then raised his hand and tapped lightly on the door. It swung open a few seconds later, revealing Grace, her eyes tired, her expression guarded. "Hey," she said, her voice quiet. "Hey," Jamal replied, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. "Can I come in?" Grace stepped aside, letting him into the small apartment. The place was a mess. Papers scattered across the coffee table, empty cups littering the counter. It looked like she hadn't slept much since the protest. Jamal sat down on the couch, the silence between them awkward, heavy. Grace remained standing, arms crossed, her gaze distant. "I don't know what to do next," Jamal admitted, breaking the tension. "It feels like everything we worked for just blew up in our faces." Grace sighed, her shoulders slumping as she sat down beside him. "I keep replaying it over and over in my head. Every decision we made, every step, how it went from a peaceful protest to—" She trailed off, rubbing her temples. "It wasn't supposed to go that way, Jamal. We had everything planned. But we couldn't control what happened," Jamal said, though the words felt hollow even to him. "We didn't throw the first punch. We didn't start the violence. No, but we were the face of it." Grace's voice cracked with frustration. "And now that's all anyone sees. The message is lost. All they care about is the riot, the property damage, the violence." Jamal leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. "So what do we do? Do we just give up? Let them win?" Grace was silent for a long time, her expression unreadable. Finally, she shook her head. "I don't know if we can give up, even if we wanted to. The fight's not over, but it feels like we're losing, doesn't it?" Jamal nodded slowly. "Yeah, it does." They sat in silence for a while, both of them grappling with the weight of what had happened. The movement they had started, the hope for real change, had been hijacked by forces beyond their control. And now, as the dust settled, they were left to pick up the pieces. At home, things had grown even more strained between Jamal and his father. Jonathan had been distant, avoiding conversations about the protest or anything remotely connected to it. When they did speak, it was brief, clipped. Jonathan asking about school or work, Jamal answering in monosyllables before retreating to his room. The divide between them felt insurmountable, as if the protest had driven a wedge into their relationship that neither knew how to remove. One evening, Jamal was in his room, scrolling through news articles about the protest, when there was a knock on his door. He looked up to see his mother, Tina, standing in the doorway, her face lined with concern. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. Jamal shrugged. "Yeah, sure." She sat down on the edge of his bed, her hands folded in her lap. For a long time, she didn't say anything, and Jamal could tell she was trying to find the right words. "I know things have been hard between you and your dad," Tina finally said. He's struggling with all of this in his own way. He cares about you, Jamal, more than anything. But he's scared." "Scared of what?" Jamal asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "That I'll end up like one of those thugs the media keeps talking about. That I'll get hurt for standing up for something that actually matters." Tina shook her head. "No, honey. He's scared of losing you." Jamal blinked, taken aback by her words. "He's been in law enforcement for so long, Jamal. He's seen what happens when protests turn violent. He's seen how easily things can go wrong. And when he saw you there, in the middle of it all," Tina's voice faltered, "he's scared because he knows what's at stake, and he's terrified that one day you won't come home." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat, but he forced it down. "I'm not just going to sit back and do nothing, Mom. People are dying. Things are messed up. Someone has to fight for change." "I know," Tina said, her voice soft but firm. "And so does your father. He doesn't know how to balance being a cop and being your dad right now. He's trying to protect you, even if he doesn't know how to show it." Jamal didn't know how to respond. He had spent so much time being angry at his father, resenting him for being on the other side of the line, that he hadn't considered how hard it must be for Jonathan to watch his son walk straight into the kind of danger he had spent his career trying to prevent. Tina stood, placing a hand gently on Jamal's shoulder. "Talk to him, Jamal. He's not the enemy. He's just a dad trying to keep his family safe." After she left, Jamal sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. He scrolled through his messages, his thumb hovering over the one from his father that he had never responded to. "Please come home safe." For the first time, Jamal wondered what his father had seen in that moment, standing on the other side of the riot shield, watching his son in the crowd. He wondered what it was like to be torn between his duty as a cop and his love for his family. The next morning, Jamal found Jonathan sitting at the kitchen table, drinking his coffee in silence. For a moment, Jamal hesitated in the doorway, unsure of how to begin. But then he remembered what his mother had said, and he took a deep breath. "Dad," Jamal's voice was hesitant, but he pressed on. "Can we talk?" Jonathan looked up, surprised. He set his coffee mug down, his expression unreadable. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Jamal sat down across from him, his fingers fidgeting nervously. I want to understand where you're coming from. About the protest. About everything." Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Jamal, it's not that I don't believe in what you're fighting for. I do. But I've seen things in my line of work that—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Things can go bad so quickly, and I'm scared, son. Scared that one day something will go wrong, and I won't be able to protect you." Jamal swallowed hard, his heart heavy with the realization of just how deep his father's fear went. "I get that, Dad, but I can't sit by and do nothing. People are suffering. They need someone to speak up for them." Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I know. I just don't want to lose you in the process."